Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show that cuts through the noise and really delivers those essential insights you need, to be well informed quickly.
Mhm.
And this deep dive, it's specifically for you, the learner, that curious mind we know you've got, whether you're like prepping for a big meeting, trying to get a handle on a new field, or maybe just feeding that hunger for knowledge.
And today we're diving into something pretty fascinating, maybe even a bit unexpected. It's about how being an expert, well, how it can sometimes actually make learning harder.
Right. And adaptability, too.
Exactly. And why being adaptable is just so crucial, particularly in the world of compliance. So our sources today, they include some really interesting research on taxi drivers, how they handle new situations, and also insights from a practical book aimed at compliance professionals.
Okay, so our mission today is what to kind of connect these dots, these seemingly quite different pieces.
That's the plan, to understand how our own expertise can be, a bit of a double-edged sword.
And why staying flexible, open to new ways of thinking is just, well, absolutely vital.
We want to give you some real aha moments, some takeaways you can actually use no matter what you're currently tackling.
Okay, let's get into it then. Let's unpack this paradox of expertise first.
Right, so let's start with the power of expertise itself. There was this study, University College London, looking at experienced London taxi drivers. They put them in an unfamiliar city in Ireland.
Okay.
And, well, unsurprisingly, these seasoned pros, they were much better at finding their way around than a control group, people without that deep navigation experience.
Right, that makes sense. Their years mastering London streets gave them an edge, a big one,
A
presumably.
huge advantage, yeah, in spatial reasoning.
Hmm.
But here's where it gets really interesting.
Uh-huh.
The researchers then threw them a curveball, tested the same drivers back in London, their home turf,
Okay.
but with a twist. They introduced new buildings, showed them videos, made it look like the cityscape had fundamentally changed.
Ah, okay. Altering their familiar environment.
Exactly. And the results? Pretty remarkable, actually.
How so?
The experienced London drivers, they really struggled significantly, even more than they did in that completely new Irish city.
Get out. More than in a totally unknown place.
Yeah. They found it incredibly difficult to adjust their sort of mental map and slot in these new structures. They performed worse than when they were somewhere completely fresh.
That is wild. They're the London experts, but the changes messed them up more than being totally lost. So what did the researchers think was going on?
Well, their reasoning was that experts and beginners, they just use different cognitive processes, different parts of the brain, almost.
How so?
Beginners tend to rely more on their working memory,
Yeah.
that short-term space where we actively juggle new information.
Right, the mental scratch pad.
Exactly. Experts, though, they've developed these highly efficient memory skills. They lean heavily on long-term memory, on established mental models. They've essentially built this incredibly detailed internal map.
Okay, so they access it almost automatically.
Precisely. And the challenge comes when new information pops up that, well, it just doesn't fit neatly into those existing frameworks.
This breaks the model.
It breaks the model. The experts struggled because these new buildings, they couldn't be easily integrated into their pre-existing, very ingrained London image. Their reliance on long-term memory, which is normally this massive asset.
Yeah.
It actually became a liability when they needed to adapt. It's just harder for them to override those, well-worn neural pathways and carve out new ones.
So their very expertise, that super detailed map of London in their heads, it actually got in the way of learning and adapting to this new information. Like their brains were just saying, nope, that doesn't compute. That doesn't belong here.
Exactly. And here's a key insight, I think, for you, the learner.
Mm-hmm.
Deep expertise in a stable situation can sometimes backfire when things change.
Because you're locked into your old ways of seeing things.
Right. Reliance on those ingrained mental models can outweigh the ability to just process the new stuff right in front of you. It really shows how profound knowledge can sometimes make it tricky to grasp genuinely new concepts, especially ones that need a big shift in perspective.
It's a fascinating idea. And yeah, a bit unsettling. Makes you wonder how this paradox plays out elsewhere, like in compliance, which is our other focus.
Absolutely. And this leads us straight to the views in that compliance book we mentioned.
Okay.
The author starts off by kind of rejecting this idea of a complete overhaul, a total transformation.
How do they frame that?
They draw a parallel between the, well, frankly, unrealistic socialist idea of creating a new man
Hmm.
and a similarly flawed concept of creating a new compliance officer.
Okay, so no magic wand to create perfect people.
Right. Instead, the book takes a much more practical and actually quite hopeful stance on our ability to adapt, human adaptability.
Hopeful. Even with that old saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks.
Yeah, the book tackles that head on. It confronts that sort of pessimistic view directly.
And what's the argument?
It argues that while, okay, you might not fundamentally change someone's core personality,
Right.
even seasoned professionals, they absolutely have the capacity for adaptation, for behavioral change. The goal isn't to, like, transform an experienced compliance officer into someone totally different.
It's more about a shift.
A shift in how they see things, yeah. A shift in perspective.
And that leads to practical changes in behavior.
Exactly. It leads to alter perception.
Yeah.
And then ultimately to change behavior. The book uses a really good comparison, I think. Learning new techniques in sports.
Okay, like what?
Think about ski jumping.
Yeah.
You had the older parallel style, right?
Yeah.
But eventually that gave way to the V style. Much more aerodynamic.
Right, I remember that change.
Well, those ski jumpers who were just stuck on the old technique, they eventually got left behind, didn't they? Outcompeted by those who embraced the new approach.
So the point is, adopting new methods, even if they feel weird at first.
Can lead to much better results. It's about embracing new means to achieve better ends.
Makes sense. You don't need a personality transplant, just a willingness to learn a better way. So what's the sort of philosophical underpinning for this belief in adaptability, especially in compliance?
Well, the book explicitly grounds its approach in the critical rationalism of Karl Popper.
Okay, Popper, remind me.
What's really interesting here is that this philosophy, it doesn't really deal in absolute truths, not fixed certainties.
Right.
Instead, it suggests that theories, knowledge, they're considered valid only until they're proven wrong, until they're refuted.
So it's all about being open to being wrong, falsification.
Exactly. The focus is entirely on the ongoing process, identifying errors, eliminating them. That's how we advance our understanding.
Yeah.
So in this context, the book isn't laying down some rigid, unchangeable set of compliance commandments. Not at all.
It's more like building blocks.
Yeah, it aims to build on existing knowledge,
Yeah.
focusing on behavior that you can actually verify
Yeah.
empirically and how you apply that in the real world of compliance. It's designed as a continuous process,
Yeah.
learning, improving, adapting.
That sounds very practical, very down to earth. The book also mentions using tricks and tips. Doesn't that sound a bit manipulative?
It's a fair question,
Yeah.
and the author addresses it directly. They clarified that the intention behind highlighting practical tricks and tips, it's not about manipulation or, unethical influence.
It's about effectiveness.
It's about making compliance more effective in achieving its legitimate goals. The focus isn't just on the why of compliance, follow the law, tick the boxes. It's also very much on the how, the practical strategies for actually achieving that adherence.
Okay, so practical methods for getting better results within the rules.
Exactly. Think about that sports analogy again. If you see an opponent using some clever trick, a new technique, that demonstrably improves their game.
You've got a choice.
Right. You could dismiss it, stick to your old ways, maybe grumble about it, or you can try to learn it yourself. Adapt it to improve your own performance.
And in that case, you're just adopting a new means to achieve a better end. Makes sense.
Precisely.
Now, our sources also touched on some historical context, didn't they? Mentioning industry consolidation in Germany and Austria. How does that connect?
Yeah, those examples, the Kohl Syndicate, IG Farben, Vereiniges Stahlwerk, they illustrate a pretty natural tendency, actually. In relatively stable markets, companies often merge, consolidate, power gets concentrated.
And initially, the government didn't really step in.
Not much, no. Initially, there wasn't a lot of state intervention. But over time, the thinking shifted. There was a growing appreciation for the benefits of, free competition.
What drove that shift?
Efficiency, mainly. When they started dismantling state monopolies, postal services, telecoms, transport drives, the productivity gains were pretty significant. That convinced a lot of people about the advantages of a more open market.
So that's like a large-scale example of adapting, of shifting perspective on how markets should work.
It is, yeah. And this leads us nicely to Joseph Schumpeter's famous idea of creative destruction.
Creative destruction always
Yeah.
sounds dramatic.
It is. Think of it like this. Progress often means tearing down the old to make way for the new. The book uses the rise and fall of Nokia in the mobile phone market as a perfect, almost ideal typical case study.
Right, they were dominant then. Poof.
Exactly. And companies, understandably, try to avoid this disruptive force. They do it in a couple of main ways.
Okay.
In stable markets, they consolidate, maybe form cartels, try to limit competition. In really dynamic markets, especially tech, they strive for dominant market positions, try to control prices, conditions.
Which often leads to antitrust
Yeah,
issues, right?
precisely. It's all about trying to avoid being the one creatively destroyed.
Staying ahead of that wave. Now, the book also included a quote from Friedrich August von Hayek, didn't it? Something about economists.
Yeah, a bad economist is only an economist.
Okay, what's the takeaway there for someone in compliance?
Well, Hayek's point is that having a very narrow focus, being too specialized, can actually be a weakness. And the book suggests, similarly, that a compliance officer shouldn't be only a compliance officer.
You need a broader perspective.
To be truly effective, yes. You need a broader understanding. See how your piece fits into the bigger picture. This links to another idea the book brings in, from Ferdinand Tönnies.
Tönnies.
His sociological distinction between community, which is based on shared values, mutual affirmation, that kind of thing,
Okay.
and society, which is more instrumental, an association for exchange, for transactions.
And understanding that helps in a company.
It helps understand the different dynamics at play within a company. You have
Yeah.
elements of both. The book argues there isn't one single ideal way to structure companies or for employees to behave,
So management is always adjusting.
constantly positioning the company, yeah. And compliance plays a key role there, advising on consequences, anticipating changes, understanding those community versus society dynamics.
This brings us to a really critical distinction the book makes. Legality versus legitimacy.
Yes, absolutely crucial. Just because something is technically legal doesn't automatically mean it's seen as right or acceptable or, well, legitimate.
Can you give some examples?
The book uses everyday ones, like, say, breaking a verbal promise but hiding behind the fact it wasn't written down. Or corporate examples, like perfectly legal but aggressive tax avoidance schemes. Or maybe those incredibly generous executive pensions that cause public outrage.
So legal, yes, but maybe not perceived as fair or right.
Exactly. And this gap, this space between what's strictly legal and what's seen as legitimate, that can be really dangerous territory.
Why dangerous?
Well, the danger is particularly high when illegality and illegitimacy actually overlap, when something is both against the rules and widely seen as wrong.
Okay.
That creates fertile ground for long-term compliance violations, often committed by quite a few employees, operating with a sort of unspoken approval from colleagues.
How do they justify it?
Rationalizations, the ends justify the means, or it's really in the company's best interest, even when they know they're bending or breaking rules. Add in pressure to hit targets in a culture that maybe values results above everything else, above open discussion.
It sounds like a recipe for ethical blind spots just spreading through the company.
It really is. And in those kinds of environments, the formal internal controls, they can just fail to be effective. Compliance efforts might just get superficial engagement. People tick the boxes, go through the motions, but don't really buy in.
It's just lip service.
Pretty much. And the book even encourages compliance officers themselves to take a hard look in the mirror. Consider whether they might be susceptible to similar rationalizations, maybe in smaller ways, little things.
That's a good point. Requires constant self-reflection, doesn't it? Even on everyday decisions. The book also touches on how the rapid pace of change in the world impacts all this.
Yeah, the author makes the observation that, in the past, the world, companies, employee values, things changed relatively slowly, predictably almost.
But not anymore.
Not anymore. Contrast that with today's really rapid pace of change, and that throws up all sorts of new ethical dilemmas. Things related to, say, supplier working conditions overseas, or business dealings with certain countries, or the ethics around mergers and acquisitions.
So compliance needs to be much more forward-looking, proactive in this shifting landscape.
Exactly. Compliance absolutely can and probably should take a leading role in navigating these new ethical territories. But, and this is crucial,
Yes.
it has to maintain a strong connection with the employees, with the reality on the ground. Otherwise, it risks becoming sort of detached, torn off, as the book puts it, losing touch with the informal rules and ethical norms that actually operate within the company day to day.
Because ultimately, it's the employees collectively who define the culture.
In many ways, yes. The totality of employees, they informally set the real rules of right and wrong within that specific organizational culture.
This makes ethics sound less like a fixed rule book and more like an evolving conversation. The book talks about ethics as a personal toolbox. What does that mean?
Yeah, the idea is that each compliance officer kind of develops their own ethical framework, their own approach using the principles and tools they encounter. The author points out a common tendency, especially for people with, say, legal or accounting backgrounds,
Which is,
a leaning towards deontological ethics. Evaluating actions based primarily on whether they adhere strictly to established laws and guidelines. Duty-based.
okay, is that bad?
Not bad, it's essential.
Ah,
But the book argues it's not enough for truly effective compliance. It argues for the necessity of also incorporating consequentialist ethics.
consequentialist.
So looking at the outcomes, the consequences of actions.
Precisely. Compliance decisions need to be perceived by employees not just as legal, but also as having legitimate, justifiable consequences. Fair outcomes.
Otherwise,
Otherwise, there's a risk the company becomes isolated, may be seen as acting unfairly, or even gets out of step with broader societal norms and laws, like becoming a sort of sect, as the book puts it, or worse. The book also tackles that perception issue again, the idea that being ethical might be seen as, well, uncool, especially maybe by younger employees.
yeah, that's a real challenge, isn't it?
Uh-huh.
For anyone promoting ethical behavior. Simply laying out logical arguments, it might not be enough.
So what does the book suggest?
It really emphasizes the need to passionately advocate for ethical positions, to connect it to real-world consequences, highlighting the negative impacts of a society where, say, corruption thrives, where connections and money matter more than ability and commitment.
So making it relatable, showing its value beyond just abstract principles, showing why it matters.
Exactly. Another point raised is this trend of employees increasingly seeking compliance approval for every little individual decision. Is that actually a good thing?
It sounds cautious, maybe diligent.
It might seem that way initially, but the book warns against this becoming the standard practice.
Why?
It can lead to employees basically avoiding responsibility, shifting it all onto compliance, and then potentially blaming compliance if a business opportunity gets missed because of caution.
Ah, okay. Passing the buck.
Right. The author actually quotes Immanuel Kant here. Sapere aude. Dare to use your own mind.
Encourage independent thinking.
Yes. Encourage independent ethical thinking, which is why investing in really good ethics training that empowers employees rather than just telling them rules, is so crucial.
The book also tackles a very common pushback, doesn't it? The argument that being too ethical will hurt the bottom line.
Ah, yes, the death blow argument, as it's sometimes called. The idea that acting ethically, being fully compliant, will inevitably mean less revenue, lower profits, maybe even job losses.
How does the book counter that?
It uses that sports analogy again, which I think is quite helpful. It distinguishes between the fundamental rules of the game, the basic conditions of action, set and enforced by the state, by regulators,
Okay, the framework.
and the individual moves, the actions you take within those rules. Ethical behavior isn't just about, pure altruism. It's about seeking advantages, yes, but doing it in a way that also benefits others, or at least doesn't harm them unfairly, all within that established legal and regulatory framework.
So it's about playing the game well according to the agreed-upon rules, finding ethical ways to win, rather than trying to bend or break the rules for an unfair advantage.
That's a good way to put it. And the book circles back to critical rationalism here when discussing how to actually approach ethical decision-making in practice.
Popper again?
Popper again, that core idea. I may be wrong, you may be right, and together we may come closer to the truth.
So apply that to ethics.
Yeah. In this view, ethics isn't like a hard science with definitive final answers. It's more like a process of problem solving in social affairs. It requires open discussion, dialogue, focused on achieving positive results, trying to align the company's competitive position with what society expects and what the law requires.
A continuous dialogue, basically.
Uh,
A willingness to adapt based on new information, different perspectives.
Exactly. And the book also includes some very practical, almost mundane advice, like not getting overly fixated on really trivial matters.
Like what?
The example given is requiring employees to return branded wall calendars they received as free gifts.
Okay, yeah, that seems a bit much.
Right. Being overly zealous on minor, insignificant issues can actually damage compliance's credibility
Yeah.
when it comes to the really serious stuff. It's about perspective.
Picking your battles.
Taking your battles, exactly. The book also briefly mentions the Eisenhower matrix, urgent versus important, as a tool for prioritization.
Right.
But it warns against this common tendency to gravitate towards tasks that are like average difficulty, easy wins,
Right.
which can lead to neglecting the really big, important problems in favor of things that are just conspicuous or easily solvable.
So keep your eye on the truly important stuff, not just the urgent or easy stuff. The book also really emphasizes looking ahead, doesn't it? Anticipating future challenges.
Yes, we often get caught up in immediate problems, firefighting. The book uses the analogy of compound interest.
Ah,
It's a powerful way to think about future issues. Small beginnings, small trends now, they can have really significant long-term consequences down the line.
so compliance needs to be proactive.
Needs to be proactive in anticipating future risks. By staying plugged into the company's strategic plans, understanding broader societal trends, engaging with relevant partners, both inside and outside the organization.
It requires that mindset of looking around corners, not just reacting to what's directly in front of you. The book also gets into the psychology of decision making, especially under pressure.
Yeah, it references some experiments by Dietrich Derner, looking at decision-making in complex scenarios like managing a small town's economy or a production process with conflicting goals, like profit versus environmental protection.
And what did they find?
They found that good decision makers, they tend to make more decisions, handle greater complexity, they address problems earlier, and crucially, they ask why questions. They dig deeper to understand root causes.
And the bad decision makers.
They get more easily distracted, tend to ask more superficial, is there questions? Just looking for simple facts, maybe.
Okay.
Interestingly, though, while good decision makers generally showed more courage in their choices, under intense time pressure, gathering too much information could actually become counterproductive.
Paralysis by analysis.
Exactly. So it's a really delicate balance between being thorough and being decisive, especially when the clock is ticking.
What about the role of gut feeling or intuition in all this?
The book acknowledges its value, definitely. While thorough research and analysis are always crucial, it recognizes the importance of listening to that gut feeling, especially in experienced decision makers. Research by Giger Enzer suggests intuitive decisions are actually quite common, particularly at higher levels in organizations dealing with really complex, messy issues.
So there's no single right way to decide.
Pretty much. The key takeaway for you, the learner, is that being open to different approaches, including trusting your intuition when it's grounded in experience, can often lead to better outcomes. It's not just about logic all the time.
The book also mentions something counterintuitive, the challenge of having too many options.
Yes, having a huge number of choices can actually make rational decision-making harder, not easier.
How does that work?
The Sultan Saladin advisor selection problem is used as a great illustration. It's about making a sequential decision looking at options one by one under uncertainty with limited time.
Okay.
And the optimal strategy is surprisingly specific. You reject a certain initial percentage of the options, roughly the first 37%. You note the best value you saw in that rejected group.
Right, establish a benchmark,
Exactly. And then you select the very next option that comes along that exceeds that benchmark.
and it works.
Statistically, it significantly increases your probability up to about 33% of choosing the absolute best option from the whole sequence.
That's fascinating. And what do people usually do?
The common tendency is to decide too early, to jump on something that looks good without seeing enough alternatives.
So the practical advice is,
Document the options you've considered. Try to estimate the total number of possibilities you might encounter relative to the time you have. Be more strategic about when you commit.
that's a really interesting, almost mathematical way to think about decision-making under uncertainty. Now, shifting back more specifically to compliance, how does goal setting work in this area? The book touched on that.
Right. Compliance usually gets integrated into the company's overall goal-setting process. Annual planning, KPIs, all that.
But it's different from, say, sales goals.
Fundamentally different in some ways. For instance, how do you really measure success in compliance? Is it the absence of violations? Or is it the presence of really robust, effective compliance systems? It's often hard to quantify.
Yeah, proving a negative is tough.
Exactly. And another key constraint, a strict condition really, is that all compliance efforts have to consider the company's ongoing economic success. You can't just impose rules that cripple the business.
So it's always a balancing act, ensuring compliance without hindering the core business too much. What's a practical approach then for setting compliance goals?
The book advocates for using intermediate goals, setting achievable milestones, and also applying the principle of the Pareto optimum,
Pareto optimum.
trying to improve one aspect of compliance without making any other aspect worse. It's about finding pragmatic solutions, making incremental improvements.
And prioritization is key.
Absolutely key. You have to focus on the tasks directly related to the core concept, the main risks, and avoid getting bogged down in things that might seem urgent, but are ultimately less important in the grand scheme of things.
The book also mentioned process learning and agile management for compliance. How do those fit in?
Process learning is fundamental. It's that cycle.
Mm.
Set targets, take action, observe results, make corrections, continuous improvement. And this includes applying agile management principles where appropriate, meaning sometimes it's better to just start, move forward in small iterative steps, rather than getting stuck in months of detailed upfront planning.
But not always.
Right. The book acknowledges Agile has limits. For well-established, standardized processes, more traditional, structured planning might still be more effective. It's about choosing the right approach for the situation.
Now let's talk about something that might seem softer, but the book says is critical. Appearance. How compliance and the officers are perceived.
Yes, the book really stresses this. Appearance isn't just a secondary thing. It's central to whether compliance actually succeeds or fails.
More than just the legal arguments.
Much more. Legal and economic arguments alone don't fully explain why people actually change their behavior. Many compliance projects fail, not because the technical solutions are bad, but because of how the compliance officer interacts with people.
Really? Are there studies on that?
Yeah, the book cites studies showing a consultant's success can depend, like 80%, on non-technical factors, how they build relationships, communicate, behave.
So it's about trust, credibility. The book even suggests compliance officers need the mindset of a seller. That sounds a bit commercial.
Might sound odd, yeah. Seller can have negative vibes for some. But the point here is the crucial need to build trust, to convey integrity through behavior that's, reserved, reliable, professionally competent. It's about effectively communicating, effectively selling the value and importance of compliance to the rest of the organization.
Okay, selling the idea, not just the rules. The book also warns about the halo effect, doesn't it? And confusing correlation with causation.
Right, the halo effect is where one really prominent feature, good or bad, just overshadows everything else. So a successful company is seen as brilliant at everything. An unsuccessful one, like Nokia or Kodak eventually, is seen as flawed in every way.
We project success or failure onto all aspects.
Exactly. And the book warns against that common error of assuming correlation equals causation. Just because two things happen together, say, high employee satisfaction and good business performance.
Doesn't mean one caused the other.
Precisely. Maybe success causes satisfaction, or maybe a third factor drives both. The book critiques studies that only look at successful companies, ignoring control groups. Those kinds of errors can lead to false conclusions about what really drives success.
Back to Schumpeter's creative destruction.
Exactly. There's no permanent magic formula for success, the book argues, not even in compliance. Things change.
Now here's a really interesting one. The book suggests using sympathy strategically. That seems counter to the impartial image of compliance.
It does, doesn't it? But the book argues, referencing Cialdini's work on influence, that sympathy, or maybe likability, can be a powerful lever for effectiveness.
How so?
Well, think about studies showing external attractiveness can subconsciously influence things like election results. Compliance officers can't control that, obviously, but they can control their behavior. Avoid being off-putting.
And more practically.
More practically, when delivering bad news, like rejecting a proposed business practice, it's often better if the announcement comes from the person or department who proposed it in the first place. Let them deliver the no.
While compliance
Should be willing, even eager, to share good news, to publicly acknowledge good practices, positive steps people take. It's about strategically managing perception and how information lands.
That makes sense. The book also just hammers home the importance of relationship maintenance. Basic stuff, almost.
Basic, but crucial. Investing time in discussions, genuinely considering different views, giving constructive feedback, it all builds trust. Creates that presumption of trust instead of a presumption of mistrust.
And the little things matter, too.
Hugely. Those seemingly minor secondary virtues, being punctual, keeping your workspace tidy, general professional demeanor, especially important for newcomers interacting with experienced colleagues, they notice.
These small signals build credibility. And the ultimate goal, the book says, is compliance out of conviction, not fear.
That's the holy grail, yes. Getting people to comply because they believe it's the right thing to do, not just because they're scared of getting caught.
How do you encourage that?
The book discusses that fascinating study on hotel towel reuse. Appealing to social proof, most guests reuse their towels.
It was way more effective than just talking about the environment.
Significantly more
Yeah.
effective, yeah. But social proof needs care. The book gives another example from a national park,
Oh, yeah.
where a sign saying, "Many visitors have stolen petrified wood," actually seemed to encourage more theft, compared to a simple, "Please don't take any wood."
Wow. So highlighting bad behavior normalized it.
Seems like it. The takeaway is that persuasive statements, especially using social proof, need to be really carefully crafted. Understand the potential impact, positive or negative.
It really shows how much psychology matters in crafting compliance messages. Now, the book moves on to the absolutely crucial role of the boss, the supervisor, management.
Yes, the superior, whether it's the board or your direct manager, they really set the tone.
Yeah.
Massively influential. The book stresses that every executive board member should know basic legal concepts, like the business judgment rule.
Which protects managers if they make informed decisions in good faith.
Broadly, yes. Compliance officers have a responsibility, the book argues, to make sure their superiors are aware of these key principles.
And understanding the boss's motivations.
Critical. Are they mainly concerned about protecting themselves, or genuinely about the company's well-being and reputation? Knowing that helps tailor your approach.
Right.
The book even gives examples of really experienced public figures making seemingly irrational, high-risk decisions,
Right.
suggesting that willpower, judgment, they can be surprisingly fragile, even at the top.
It's a reminder they're human, too, susceptible to errors. The book also mentioned how lots of decisions can weaken willpower.
Yeah, multiple factors, long work days, constant decision-making, personal stress, they can all deplete willpower, make people more susceptible to making those poor single-exception decisions.
The just this once trap.
Exactly. The book recommends practical things. Avoid big decisions when your willpower feels low. Hesitate, sleep on it, get a second opinion. And crucially, just learn to say no when in doubt.
Simple but hard advice sometimes. It also touched on managing relationships with superiors and getting resources.
Yeah, that delicate balancing act. Finding the right level of closeness. And advocating for the resources compliance needs, which often means selling the need. Sometimes even using tactics like asking for more initially to make the real request seem reasonable.
What about the really tough situations when a boss is actively against compliance?
The book faces that reality. The compliance opponent boss, withholding resources, hindering investigations.
What can you do?
While compliance should always advocate for its interests, explain the risks. But the book acknowledges there are limits. Ultimately, if the situation is untenable, the compliance officer has to act on their own personal conviction of right and wrong.
Which might mean leaving.
Unfortunately, yes. In extreme cases, that might be the only ethical choice.
A stark reminder. Now, the book talks about the inner circle in a company. What's that about?
The inner circle. That's where the informal communication happens, the real influence. It's less about official reports and hard data, more about receiving and shaping opinions, understanding trends, picking up on those weak signals.
Early warnings.
Early warnings, yeah. This informal info doesn't change what's right or wrong, legally, but it allows compliance to tailor its activities much more effectively. Know what to focus on, when, how intensely.
It relates to Covey's circles.
Yes, Stephen Covey's circle of concern versus circle of influence. Effective compliance, the book argues, focuses on expanding its influence, not just worrying about everything in its concern. Being proactive, shaping the environment, not just reacting.
Avoiding that old school reactive approach. The book also stresses knowing each other in this network. Why is that so important?
What's human nature, isn't it? We wonder what others think of us, especially bosses or key colleagues. Research shows while we're okay at guessing group averages, we can be way off about individuals, even life partners.
Really?
Yeah, an experiment showed a 50% error rate in predicting partners' views, but asking directly beforehand halved the errors.
Wow. Just ask.
Just ask. It highlights the importance of open, direct communication. Bridging those gaps in understanding between superiors and subordinates about concerns, performance, expectations.
Avoiding assumptions. What about rumors? That's part of the informal network, too.
Definitely. Rumors spread like wildfire. Gain credibility fast. Compliance needs to be tapped into that informal flow to hear them, check their truthfulness quickly before they cause real damage or encourage bad behavior.
And you only hear them if you're in the loop.
Pretty much. Being part of that inner circle is essential for access.
It sounds almost like intelligence gathering. The book even compares it to intelligence agencies.
It does. A Harvard study on intel agencies found mutual support, informal info sharing, Answering questions, exchanging knowledge was the central factor in their success.
And that applies in companies too.
Research confirms it. Employee support directly impacts sales, results, customer quality, turnover. Fostering that collaborative, supportive environment isn't just nice, it's good business.
The book also mentions something surprising: disturbance and contradiction fostering creativity.
Yeah, counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
An experiment showed introducing false answers into group tasks actually led to more creative responses overall.
Why would that be?
It suggests that environments with a bit of friction, a bit of error, can sometimes push people towards better, less predictable solutions, break them out of standard thinking.
So compliance shouldn't just talk to lawyers and accountants.
Exactly. Seek out people in the inner circle from marketing, HR, other areas. Get different perspectives, spark creative problem solving.
That makes sense. Shake things up a bit. The book also tackles a practical hurdle. The word compliance itself can be off-putting.
Unfortunately, yeah, it can make people uneasy, defensive. So it's really important for compliance officers to proactively communicate the enabling role. That compliance helps ensure long-term success, even if it restricts some short-term stuff.
Frame it positively.
Frame it positively. Highlight the good context, like relatively low corruption in DACH countries, which compliance helps maintain. Be proud of the contribution, present it offensively, not defensively.
Phone the value proposition. The book also had practical tips on using company events.
Yeah, be aware of meetings with only partial attendance. Could be useful to be there. Check calendars, liaise with organizers, accept invitations initially to see if regular attendance is worthwhile.
And offer practical help.
Offering practical help, events prep, hospitality, it's a great way to build those informal connections. But, crucially, always maintain ethical standards. No gossip, no bad-mouthing.
Right. The book mentioned organizing contacts concentrically.
Yeah, like circles. More important relationships get more intensive exchange, but always value the individual. It's about strategic networking.
And constantly gauging the mood in the company.
Absolutely. Through lots of conversations, understand the different perspectives out there, and use that understanding in interactions, training, exams. Show compliance is connected to the business reality.
The book also talks about internal allies. Who are the key ones?
Natural allies are often within the company's risk management systems, RMS. So risk management itself, controlling, internal monitoring, and especially internal audit.
And controlling and accounting, too.
Definitely need good relationships there, too. Build trust, partnership.
What about the relationship with internal audit specifically? Can be tricky sometimes.
Historically, yeah, there's overlap, potential for competition. The book stresses just reading audit reports isn't enough. You need regular communication, exchanging impressions during audit planning. Compliance can give valuable input. Cooperation is key, especially for detecting individual violations.
And engaging with controlling and accounting, why is that vital?
Well, almost all business activity leaves a trace in the accounts, right? Compliance needs to understand those areas. It's not just about obvious things like entertainment or gifts. Accounting colleagues often know the more creative ways transactions can be obscured.
So leverage their expertise. Data protection comes into play too?
Always. Data protection needs to review the permissibility of information queries, data sharing between functions.
What are the main reasons to form these alliances? And what gets in the way?
Benefits. Diverse information leads to more effective work. Operational advantages through coordination. And don't underestimate simple praise, public acknowledgement of helpful contributions.
Obstacles.
Lack of trust, maybe personal friction. But the book stresses cooperation should be based on commitment to the company's goals, even without perfect personal sympathy.
Moving down the hierarchy, the book talks about operational management. What's their role?
That's the first level with personnel responsibility, department heads, plant managers, etc. They're crucial because they shape the lived culture for employees.
More than formal policies.
Often, yes. Remember, Drucker, culture eats strategy for breakfast. It's how supervisors behave, what they signal, that makes compliance real for individuals. Employees watch closely. Does the boss support this, or just see it as a hassle?
Subtle cues matter hugely. And finally, engaging with employees directly.
Employees are the front line, right? Direct contact with customers, suppliers. The book notes the trend towards standardized training and data analysis.
But warns that's not enough.
Right. Those methods won't necessarily uncover why people make bad decisions or encourage self-reporting. Direct contact with everyone is impractical, sure. But effective compliance enables employees to easily seek out contact with compliance when they need it,
Making it approachable.
and fostering a sense of shared responsibility. Company-wide compliance needs every employee feeling responsible within their capacity. Like, societal security depends on individuals intervening.
The book gets into that intervention question, right?
Yeah.
Turn a blind eye or get involved.
Yes. It presents a 5-step process for an employee noticing something. Notice of art. Assume responsibility. Decide how to intervene, act. The key message. Intervention is almost always better than inaction.
Does the employee have to solve it themselves?
Rarely. Often it's about formal non-competence, recognizing it's not your job to fix, but your responsibility to report it to the right function, like compliance. Immediate action is seldom needed. The book uses safety examples to illustrate different situations: low-high complexity, low-high risk.
And in high complexity, high risk situations.
Mutual trust is vital for information sharing. Compliance often needs to piece together reports from various individuals to get the full picture.
The book also revisits informal information gathering here.
Yeah, leveraging existing contacts. Regular chats with purchasing about suppliers, controlling about financial plans. You get info you wouldn't otherwise see. Talk to the direct employee involved with costs, not just central accounting. Compliance-relevant stuff often surfaces there first.
So how can compliance make it easier for employees to share this info?
Be approachable. Open look, friendly demeanor, personal address when possible. Encourage informal sharing. Remember, information exchange is give and take. Manage expectations, promise to act on info, but don't necessarily promise immediate solutions or bypassing official channels prematurely.
The book also mentioned the challenge experts face in being understood, the knocking study.
Ah, yes, the tapping out a song melody experiment. People drastically overestimate how well others understand them, especially when they have the tune in their head. Experts often struggle to adapt their communication.
So the only reliable way is
Ask. Specifically, ask individual confidants from your target group if your message is actually clear and understandable. Get feedback.
a dose of humility needed. What about dealing with beginners, newcomers?
It's a delicate balance. Avoid being overly casual, buddy-buddy, but also avoid being strictly authoritarian. Take young people seriously. Give them frameworks for ethical decisions. Explain the company perspective, but ultimately the individual decides. If their values differ too much, it might not be a good fit.
The book distinguishes influence from manipulation again here.
Yes. Influence, changing attitudes openly, versus manipulation, covert influence for exploitation. Important distinction, especially given historical sensitivities in some regions. Targeted influence is okay, even necessary, but requires open justification. Be transparent.
And recognize newcomers are already being influenced.
From day one, including by colleagues who might be negative about compliance, useless regulations, etc. Compliance has to proactively counter that, not wait until formal training.
The book had that interesting bit about public commitment solidifying beliefs. The POW example.
Yes, the Korean War POWs induced to make small, public, anti-U.S. statements. It led to lasting belief change because of our desire for internal consistency. Publicly stating something, even small, creates pressure to maintain that stance.
Then the book discussed group dynamics, groupthink.
Right. The more effort a group invests, the harder it is to admit it might be wrong or failing. Illustrated by simulations where groups stuck to flawed compromise strategies due to fear of more conflict, strategic inflexibility.
And the loyalty circle.
Where insecure leaders hire based on loyalty, suppressing criticism, leads to inefficiency, inflexibility. Very dangerous.
Contrasted with strong, cohesive groups.
Strong groups can act fast, decisively, but they can fail spectacularly if a fundamental change is needed, because they might resist questioning core assumptions.
So compliance itself, as a group, needs to think about its own cohesion.
Exactly. Compliance teams often function as groups. The right level of cohesion is a decision. It needs ongoing fine-tuning, especially with team changes. It's both an organic primary group and a planned secondary group.
What skills does the book highlight for compliance officers?
Different from typical leadership skills, often. Emphasis on self-reflection, understanding others, empathy, cooperation, communication, conflict resolution, handling criticism well.
And the need for continuous change and reflection within compliance.
Absolutely. Effective compliance requires constant change by and within the function. Alternating action and reflection. Change can come from existing staff adopting new behaviors, slow, or new hires, faster, but integration challenges.
The book used the 4-card problem to illustrate confirmation bias.
Yes, the Wasson selection task. Our tendency to seek info confirming our beliefs, ignore info refuting them. Explained why people wrongly flip certain cards when testing a rule like vowel on one side, even number on the other. We prefer confirmation.
And this bias is amplified by assumptions.
Unjustified assumptions make confirmation bias even worse. Two key takeaways there.
The book noted the proliferation of monitoring concepts after scandals.
Yeah, corporate collapses lead to more audits, more terms thrown around internal control, monitoring, risk management, governance, compliance, often with fuzzy definitions. Management decides the structure, but compliance needs clear separation to work effectively. Find pragmatic solutions.
It distinguishes controls from examinations.
Yes. Controls are present-oriented, ongoing target actual comparisons integrated into workflows done by process owners. Examinations, audits, are past-oriented, one-time planned actual comparisons outside workflows done by independent bodies.
And compliance officers should be wary of taking on too much operational control.
Right. Don't get flattered into approving every operational decision. That blurs responsibility. Respect internal audits rule, too.
Respect their role in legally sound comparisons, adherence to labor data laws during investigations.
Exactly. Compliance should know and follow company guidelines on when to involve internal audit.
And cooperate closely during audit planning and execution.
Yes. Suggest areas for examination based on weak signals, not just known violations. Understand their standard programs. Be on the distribution list for reports.
What happens when serious violations are suddenly found? Potential rivalry.
High management interest, yeah. Potential rivalry between compliance and audit over who leads the investigation. The book advises strongly against this. Clear roles are vital.
The separate marching common strike principle.
Clear division of labor based on core competencies, but daily information exchange during investigations. Avoid duplication, leverage strengths.
And cooperation continues into follow-up.
Absolutely. Implementation control of agreed measures needs clear responsibility assigned. Avoid loss of interest or confusing double messaging.
Compliance needs a systematic approach to its own examinations.
Consistent, understandable approach for deciding when and how to examine issues, when to involve audit, based on importance and urgency.
The book then frames compliance as enforcing societal norms within the company.
Fundamentally, yes. When employees question if something is right or wrong, they rely on personal judgment, not just guidelines. Compliance can't dictate that judgment, but must ensure people understand consequences, especially the legality versus legitimacy distinction, and expose rationalizations.
Face-to-face training is valuable for initial contact.
Even if large sessions don't yield specific violation info, the personal interaction can be an invitation for confidential contact later.
But influence requires more than one training session.
Definitely. Learning curves plus values are dynamic, shaped by ongoing social contact inside and outside the company. Social values drive action. Compliance needs persistent reinforcement, especially against negative influences.
Logistics matter for training. Location, format.
Consider central versus local training, travel time, maybe combined with other central programs. Clearly, separate lecture, prod info, from dialogue, preparing for confidential chats.
And compliance officers don't need to be slick communicators.
No, aim for reasonable skills. Being seen as making a genuine effort on an important topic, even if not polished, can actually boost credibility. Authenticity helps.
Avoid overly simplistic black and white views in training.
Yes, real dilemmas have trade-offs. Oversimplifying undermines credibility and doesn't prepare employees for reality.
The book discussed attribution bias. Excuses versus character flaws.
Fundamental attribution error, yeah. We blame others' bad behavior on their character, our own on the situation. Explains why excuses dominate explanations of our own misconduct, helps maintain positive self-image, even if it's recurring.
The theory of planned behavior came up again. Intention needs control.
Yes, intention only leads to behavior if behavioral control, skills, resources, is successful. The internal control system is a key behavior control for compliance.
And the moral account idea. Balancing good and bad deeds.
People mentally track good deeds, feel they've earned the right for occasional misconduct, rationalizing violations because I'm usually compliant.
The book contrasted social norms and market norms.
Social norms, goodwill, relationships versus market norms, monetary exchange. Both motivate, but mixing them is tricky. Like offering to pay a friend for dinner changes the relationship.
In gifts versus money, Simmel's distinction.
Money facilitates exchange with strangers, no lasting obligation. Gifts create social relationships, demand reciprocation, potentially dependence.
Interested parties might deliberately blur these norms.
Yes, offering gifts, broadly defined, to create obligations, influence decisions. Especially tricky when a colleague becomes your boss. Past social exchanges become leverage.
How past misconduct is handled sends a strong signal.
Absolutely. perpetrators, and everyone else. Watch how past offenders are treated. Links to the next section on post-discovery. Need to learn from mistakes, minimize violations.
Acknowledge the incorrigible few.
Some will always intentionally act against company interests. Effective compliance aims to reduce their number, especially if values are key in hiring promotion.
After discovery, balance justice and proportionality.
Discovery brings huge interest. Management, legal, audit. Fair penalties are crucial to encourage future reporting. Proportionality, not mercilessness, should guide handling the delinquent.
A functional CMS helps minimize penalties in legal cases.
Yes, if criminal prosecution happens, a functional CMS is a given for penalty mitigation.
Treat the aftermath as an opportunity for future avoidance.
Yes, identify and eliminate underlying deficiencies revealed by the incident.
Technical progress creates new gaps, like the executive trick.
Exactly. New technologies create new avenues for violations. Constant vigilance needed.
Compliance and audit should self-reflect after violations.
Yes, consider their own potential contribution to the failure.
Yeah.
Leads to improvements.
The internal company court has limitations.
Management's decision is like a court ruling, but internal processes lack full legal safeguards, impartiality, representation, etc. Compliance often operates in gray areas, not just clear thou shalt not rules.
Protect the accused's personality, address rumors.
Crucial. Promptly protect personal rights. Use contacts to dispel rumors.
Damage compensation needs realism. Full repayment, unlikely.
Often, yes, damages are huge. Repayment plans more viable than immediate enforcement, which could cause bankruptcy. Charitable donations for minor gift invitation issues avoid pettiness. Using daily rates based on income can help determine fair amounts.
Continued employment might be preferable.
Like Peter and Paul, maybe. If colleagues agree, allows the person to explain, emphasize circumstances over character.
Manage public image transparently, but protect privacy.
Public interprets handling similarly to employees. Be transparent, but protect the individual. Affected person could, with agreement, publicly admit mistake and consequences, for example, donation.
But the main focus should be organizational change.
Yes, address the individual case, but shift focus to organizational fixes to prevent recurrence.
Conflicts are inevitable. Limits to here I stand.
Conflicts are normal. Scarcity, differing interests, coordination needs. Rigid stances often fail. Politics law can override economics. Compromise is necessary.
Brutal enforcement has long-term costs.
Short-term win, but breeds resentment, revenge. Compromise is usually better long-term.
Behavioral economics of honesty, dishonesty. Airley's work.
Most value honesty, but many engage in minor dishonesty even without risk. Usually not to the max, maintaining a mostly honest self-image. Cheating groups solved more math problems.
Power dynamics and conflict. Compliance versus manager.
Compliance relies on bureaucratic legal power. Managers might ignore it, escalate, believing their power, results, indispensability ties is stronger. If they're right, management might overrule compliance, demonstrating the manager's greater power. The power source is often hidden.
Unaddressed power imbalances worsen things.
If compliance doesn't understand addressed power, conflicts won't improve. Might worsen if the other party sees their power works, can lead to public escalation, questioning of compliance by others.
Compliance needs to understand power, ideally win confrontations.
Yes, needs deeper understanding of power to prevail more often, maintain authority.
Motives and factors of power beyond hierarchy. Winning breeds winning.
Power gradients exist everywhere. Winning conflicts increases likelihood of winning more, testosterone effect in fish. Star performers often seek conflict. Each win subtly alters the brain. Androgen receptors. Context-dependent work versus home.
Surprising influences. Color worn. Posture. Signature size.
Even minor things impact dynamics. Red jerseys win more in Olympic boxing. Space-occupying postures. Large signatures signal and maybe strength and power.
The trend of agility. Consulting height.
Agility is current trend, often pushed by consultants. Origins in software, now company-wide, including compliance.
Distinguish owner agility from employee agility.
True agility, risk-taking, pivots, inherent to owners, founders. Employees operate within structures.
Compliance as enabler, not preventer. Don't overreact to trends.
Book sees compliance as driver enabler. Doesn't need to jump on every trend like agility. Let some fads pass.
No obligation for external compliance audits.
Providers create pressure, but no legal mandate. Commissioned by board management. Compliance should understand the drivers.
Limited influence once audit is commissioned.
Content and scope largely decided by others. Compliance has little control then.
Analogy to technical inspections. Vehicles plants.
Focus on adherence to rules, risks, safety reputation. Scope costs tend to increase. Usually doesn't assess positive performance or the driver's skill, compliance effectiveness.
Unlikely to get a truly glowing audit report.
Auditors are cautious, avoid future accountability, manage expectations.
Negative reports can be strategically useful sometimes.
Yes, understaffed, unqualified, new leadership can highlight issues, avoid blame for past problems.
Manage the audit process. Negotiate findings.
Ongoing communication avoids surprises. Negotiate findings, delete, justify, relativize. Use compliance's own experience discussing internal results.
Seek client feedback on the audit experience.
Yes, gauge satisfaction of internal clients to influence future auditor selection.
Use tit for tat with compromise tendency with auditors.
Moderate conflict potential usually.
Mm.
Reciprocal responses plus willingness to compromise can work.
Leverage experience from both sides. Examiner, examine.
Compliance officers have been examiners, can learn from audit about resistance tactics.
React to examiner behavior during the audit tactically.
Mirror their approach on time, workspace, data, discussions. Can balance the dynamic.
Strategic outsourcing. Maintain core competencies.
Can't fully outsource core compliance, but manage capacity strategically. Anticipatory planning, shift non-critical tasks.
Involve purchasing for transparency in external services.
Crucial. Ensure scrutiny of who gets contracts and why.
Address perception of illegitimate freehand contracts.
High consultant fees, lack of bidding often viewed negatively internally.
Trade-offs of known versus new service providers.
Known providers offer predictability, avoid disaster, but cost more. For long-term needs, developing own pool of fairly paid providers can be better.
Career choice and situation alignment. Self-assessment framework.
Figure 21.1, not shown. Career right, wrong versus situation incorrect. Guides action. Improve, change company, try to stay effective, or seek alternatives.
Importance of perseverance early career. Continuous learning.
Stay 2+ years early on. CV, learning. Gain experience. Even learn what doesn't work.
Consider profession change if consistently dissatisfied.
Realistic alternative if relocation isn't an option. Keep plans confidential until decision is final.
The necessity of luck for compliance officers. Schneider's view.
Unusual requirement, yeah. Luck plays a role alongside qualifications and effort.
Aspects of happiness. Role of luck versus individual control.
Varied views on happiness. Emphasis on individual control can create unrealistic expectations for compliance officers. Frank simulation. In competitive fields, small talent differences amplified by luck lead to disproportionate success.
Action recommendations. Reduce competition. Increase attempts.
Don't be fatalistic, but talent, effort are relative to competitors. Easy job search increases competition. Build defensible position. Highlight unique contribution, e.g. preventing liability. Increase initiatives, new solutions, training, to give luck more chances, even if success rate per attempt drops.
Accept the factor of luck.
Crucial. Accept luck's influence, good and bad, alongside skills, resources, commitment. Data supports it.
Strategies for leveraging luck. Reduce participants, increase entries.
Reduce competitors by developing specialized uncommon skills, language law, tech knowledge, behavioral insights, digital AI. Increase entries by actively seeking opportunities to apply skills, propose solutions.
Pitfalls of over-reliance on motivation resilience. Gurus.
Critiques gurus blaming failure solely on lack of motivation. Compliance officers can adopt similar control conviction, overlooking luck.
Benefits of negative emotions. Evolutionary value.
Counterintuitive view. Negative emotions signal problems, aid concentration analysis, reduce stereotypes, improve witness memory, promote perseverance.
Negative effects of excessive positive emotions.
Downsides. Self-centeredness, stereotypes, fraud, dishonesty, reduced empathy, distraction, less detail-oriented, increased uncontrolled risk.
Importance of emotional variety, psychological flexibility.
Well-being from range of emotions, not just positivity. Flexibility, adapting to ups, downs, more crucial than constant high spirits. After rain comes sunshine.
Changes after discovering a compliance violation. Costs and gaps.
Foreseeable costs, damage, fines, claims, loss of status are primary concerns. Equally important. Understand control gaps revealed, enabling targeted investigation. Needs resources.
Hierarchical level and multiple offenders raise systemic issue.
Grave situation if high-level multiple offenders involved. Is company bordering on criminal organization? Illegal plus illegitimate? Intervention might need external action, antitrust, or address legal but illegitimate practices, tax avoidance.
Distinguish puzzles versus secrets in failure analysis.
Failure reveals a puzzle, missing info, flawed logic, or a secret deliberate withholding. Analyze not just from present, but try to understand decision-makers' context at the time. Nuanced view.
Tailor solutions and communication based on failure type.
Approach to finding perpetrator preventing errors differs. Communicated assessment influences future behavior. Puzzle implies more data analysis. Secret implies collaboration. Open communication about uncertainty. Focus on learning, not blame.
The Barry-Manilow effect offers consolation.
Gilovich's research. We overestimate how much others notice our embarrassing actions. Like the teacher. Lesson. We are not as important as we think.
Okay, so bringing it all together then, this deep dive, it's really shown us how even deep expertise can, well, create blind spots, can it?
Absolutely.
Highlighting that critical need for adaptability, especially now with things changing so fast.
Absolutely. And that distinction between legal and legitimate.
Crucial. We saw the pitfalls of ignoring that. And the power dynamics. Understanding formal authority, but also that informal influence.
Yeah, the whole complex web within organizations and balancing logical analysis with that intuitive gut feeling when making decisions.
It seems understanding these nuances, it really is a shortcut to being well-informed. Offers surprising insights that honestly apply way beyond just compliance, right?
I think so. These are pretty universal dynamics.
So here's a final thought then for you, the learner. Think about a time, maybe recently, when your own deep knowledge, your own experience might actually have made it difficult for you to see a new perspective or adapt to a change.
Yeah, that's a tough question to ask yourself, honestly. What specific steps could you take maybe next time to consciously challenge your own expertise, to cultivate a more flexible, open mindset?
Something to mull over. We really encourage you to keep reflecting on these concepts, see how they resonate with your own world, your own experiences and interests. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.